that's used to deceive, right? And the controlled narrative of how that language is used and how it's put out and how people pick it up. So, for example, I think it was like in 2008, the Catholic Church put out a whole booklet on things that are a sin, right? Or things that are bad to the Catholic Church. I mean, there was all kinds of stuff in there. There was, Hinduism, there was yoga was banned from the Catholic Church. I mean, it was like a considerable sized booklet that they put together on a lot of the things that people were waking up to, kind of, that are not New Age, but are very, traditional, but they were being called New Age stuff. And the fact that the Catholic Church put it out was propaganda, saying these are the things that we are against. Well, of course, everyone that's against the Catholic Church, which was most people, because they were waking up, were like, well, if you're against that, then I'm going here. So literally, almost single-handedly, the Catholic Church controlled the narrative of New Age. Period, end of story. And I want to say, I think it was like 2006, maybe it was even like 2004, when the whole New Age thing really started kicking up, and yoga really started kicking up, and meditation really started kicking up. And a lot of it was due to the seesaw. Catholic Church on one side, you either were with us, or the other side now was the New Age, right? So it was the 2D. You're either Catholic, involved with Catholic, or, you're on the other side of, this pamphlet and all the information in the pamphlet, and then people just took it and ran, right? Because they want to be against the Catholic Church. And in this reality, it's a 2D. I'm either for, I'm against. For, I'm against. And then we can't use our critical mind to think, because we can't assimilate information and data that's going to be more in the gray area, where we can put the pieces of the puzzle together to create the puzzle, to get a bigger, broad understanding of the puzzle, because we're always fighting against. We're either with or against. With or against. And a lot of my native teachers talk about, this whole light and dark thing, which is like, in traditional shamanism, like in sorcery and these other types of things, they use the dark with the light. There is a balance of everything there, because there can't be a fight. Otherwise, you can't use the energies, and you can't use the medicines, and you can't really gain the understanding. So, having to get into a place of neutrality, which is in the center of it all, out of the seesaw that's going up and down in the 2D. And then the other thing is, like, it's in all of us, because we are two-dimensional beings. We have two lobes, which are two significant brains. Our brain is not attached physically. When you take it out of the skull, it flops open, right? The only way that it works is kind of by, sending electrical volts back and forth between the lobes. So we have two brains. We have two legs. We have two arms. We're pretty much sectioned off into two-dimensional beings. We have a physical body and a spirit, right? So two. And so the way that we deal with things is not in a unified spiritual way. We deal with things, I'm either for or I'm against. So one side of my brain is operating, or the other side of my brain's operating. We're not operating in a whole brain. We're not operating in a unified physical structure because we're not in a unified brain. So there's no possible way that we could operate in a unified physical structure. If you have one foot that is larger than the other, if you have one eye that's bigger than the other, if you have, these things, that tells you that you're not a unified being, and you're not in a unified whole brain function, that you are fractured in a 2D sense. So you're in some kind of battle. And, the other thing, too, is like my indigenous teachers tell me, there's nowhere to get other than in your own mind. Because you do this work doesn't mean that your outside world is ever going to change, right? But you can still be beaten up. You can still have your car stolen. You can still not have enough money to feed yourself. You can still have all these things. It says is that you aren't attached to it anymore. So, for example, recently I just did a video on my YouTube channel, and it talks about that, like, you know, this place that I've come to, realization that, you know, being homeless under the bridge, you know, dirty and starving and freezing and whatever else, no one cares about you, shouldn't be any different than living in a mansion and having all the food and a private chef and a swimming pool, right? It shouldn't affect us differently, because if it does affect us differently emotionally, then we're on the seesaw, right? Between one or the other, right? One's better than the other, right? And the thing is like the neutral place, the gray place is like neither of them are important, neither of them matter. And if I should have an experience with one of them or the other, I shouldn't feel a certain way about it. And that's when you start to come into like a unified system and a unified being. And I think that's kind of like where you start to realize, like, even if you're living homeless under a bridge. And then the other thing too is like, gosh, our mind wants to justify it. Like I had a friend of mine go off, watch that video and didn't get the whole thing at all, and wanted to justify, well, you know, when you do live under a bridge, you know, at least you're free. You don't have to have bank accounts or, you know, driver's license or deal with, you know, this, that, or other thing. And, you know, it can be pretty difficult and challenging. He said, but, you know, on the other side, you know, if you have money and a house and all this stuff, you know, you're kind of enslaved to all those things because you got to pay taxes and you got to keep your bank accounts going. And I was like, dude, you missed the whole concept. Now you just went into that whole, you know, mind effing that the mind likes to do to stay separated. You know, like you've got to defend it or justify it when none of that even matters, right? Defending or justifying the experience, right? So that what you can like get whatever out of it, find the holier parts of it, or whatever else, instead of just coming to a place of either way, it doesn't bother me, right?
Yes.
What concerns me is my own mind. What concerns me is my own heart. My body doesn't concern me or where my body lands, right? It's about my mind and how my mind operates in the reality. And that is not going to change the reality. Think about how many spiritual masters have somehow flopped into this world and tried to teach us things that to this day people can't even grasp. And it's because of this whole 2D model that we're living in. But yeah, we're told it's a 3D. That's the narrative. But where's the third part? Where is that third part? In the native way, traditional ancient way that goes back to when this world was started, it's a 4 and a 7. Because in this world, in order to have a proper foundation and be in balance, it has to have 4 sides. Right? It has to have 7 points of access. So the way that we operate, the light, the dark, the good, the bad, the what if, the what could, the how, what, why, where, when, you know, all of that stuff doesn't really matter. The thing that matters is coming into a place where you don't struggle to try to keep a roof over your head to be distracted, right? That you can step away from a lot of that stuff. And if you fall by the wayside, I've lived in my van. Right now I live in a shed. And it's been pretty cold this winter. Let me just tell you how cold it is. But I've lived in my van since 2006, since the narrative was destroy all alternative therapies across the United States. And I ended up involved in that. Now they just murder you. They just get rid of you. But, you know, I did fight them. I did probably not teach them a lesson, but I did teach them that I was quite awake and I kind of understood everything that was going on. But never really been able to financially get back on my feet. So And, people will say, well, that's your lesson. What? To defy the powers that be? My lesson is to starve and be in poverty.
Hey, I got a question for you in a total different area that I wanted to talk to you before things got off. Yesterday you sent me something about the Zim being released. Can you go into the economic structure and what's going on with money and that?
Well, I think this is the deal. I think as nations, right, individual nations, I think that they are God, I hate the word waking up because, people wake. Awake is a funeral.
Yeah.
Right? Let's just talk about that word. So, you woke up. Oh, you attended a funeral? Awake. Oh, you went to awake. Whose funeral did you go to? I mean, we have to be really careful here about, the words that we're using to describe. And the problem is that we have a limited vocabulary. And I think as long as we consciously realize we're using a word in a certain type of structure, but it has this meaning, and it's rooted in thousands and thousands of years of how it was communicated, we're activating that word as a symbol in that vibration. So I think that there are some cultures that are kind of waking up. The Tower of Babel kind of comes back to mind, where more people are speaking English, more people are speaking different languages, more people are interacting on the internet, having discussions about their location, what it looks like, their environment, how they were raised, how their culture was. And so we're starting to build that tower again, to defy the gods, on some level, except for they can't seem to get rid of the internet because, people are so attached to it. I think that if worldwide, that if they just shut it down all of a sudden, that there would be such riots of epic proportion. And it might be the main thing that, keeps it going. So there are countries that, waking up, or however you want to say it, becoming conscious that they have been under a narrative because of the financial stuff, and that they have been enslaved as workers. And I a lot of my native friends, they basically are so right hemisphered and in genetics that they want to have like a relationship with the creator or the nature, the creation, in a way that they don't want to get up at 6 o'clock and go do a job. In their genetics, it's just not available to them. And no matter how hard these extraterrestrials have tried to breed the native out of them, that genetic is so entrenched in them. So there are genetics on this planet of beings that came here originally that cannot be destroyed, right? And because of their defiance, I think, not defiance, but haunch non-participation in the rest of it. And the reason why more of us were created to kind of be kind of an enslavement role, I guess. I don't know how else to talk about it. But there are some countries that the people have said that they've had enough. And so there are countries that are making changes. And for example, yesterday we've been waiting for a year and a half for Zimbabwe, which turns out to be in the narrative, because I have no proof. If I don't have proof, like I haven't gone there and seen it physically or held it in my hand, it's a narrative, right? I'm being shown something and I'm being given a vocabulary. But the narrative is that in Zimbabwe, they have some precious metals that are not found anywhere else in the world, right? that can actually give us green types of technology for green power, or quantum power, or whatever you want to call it, 0 point power, or whatever, that can literally, get rid of oil and a lot of these, other things that are going on, which gets people out of not being enslaved, and their land masses not being enslaved by the powers that be controlling their oil, or their this, or their that, or their diamonds, or whatever. And so Zimbabwe has been working for a while with China and Russia as a part of the BRICS, along with South Africa. So the BRICS, is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That's what it stands for. These are the original nations that have decided that they've had enough, that their people have had enough of the USD, the Federal Reserve, central banks. And these are countries that have been accumulating physical gold. Not just the narrative of gold, paper instruments that are sold on a stock exchange, bought and sold, but actually accumulated physical gold, tons and tons and tons and tons of gold. Which, by the way, if there are gods controlling us, extraterrestrials, and we look at some of the hidden history, whatever, narrative, what was the main thing they wanted? The gold. To take it off-world, right? So if these countries are actually, got this gold and they're accumulating it and have been accumulating it, who are they really taking the power from? These beings and extraterrestrials that want those resources to take off-world, to take back to their planets. So they're actually stopping this whole, maybe not stopping this whole enslavement process, but they're trying to attempt to control the narrative away from, right? It's taken a lot of time. I think China has been working at this for 40 years, right? They say that one of the oldest people that they have in China, they call him the old man, that he's like 700 years old, and that he actually has fingernails that are long and touch the ground, and toenails, because he can actually kind of come in and out of this world. And he, at one point in time, was one of the gods or the controllers. And he now is, let's not say operating for the good or the bad. I think that whole narrative needs to stop because it's too deep. But he's maybe decided to work with the people now who are controlling the gold. Because, he may want to get some to take back where he needs to take it. So now what's happened is that Zimbabwe, we've been waiting a year and a half, obviously the narrative keeps telling us that there's going to be a GCR or whatever else. I have no idea how that's going to play out or what's going to play out. But I know that yesterday, so Zimbabwe last October was supposed to announce their new gold-backed currency. And they were supposed to do it the October before that, and then a year comes along in the October, and they're still not doing it. They're still dragging their feet or whatever else. Well, what happened is that the country, went so bad into chaos that Russia had to step in January, I think it was, Putin, to straighten it out, because when they were all over at Davos, literally the whole country of Zimbabwe rioted. It was massive civil war. It was so far out of control because the criminals, have been dragging their feet against what the people want and what the people desire. And so they just flipped out. They finally just totally flipped their cookies, and they just totally flipped. And they didn't want to work. They didn't want to do trade. They weren't going to work for anything. They weren't going to do anything. Forget it. They're going to burn everything down and have a massive riot. And it went on. It was so severe that the president had to leave Davos immediately and go back to his country. And then Putin stepped in and started helping them to get rid of the corruption. And since that time, has made rapid, Zimbabwe is supposed to be like the first domino in this happening. So there are a lot of things that had to happen in Zimbabwe, right? So they had to get released from the sanctions of the U.S. Well, I think that happened in December. Trump released them from all sanctions. Then they had to be released from the EU. And as of last week, it kept coming out in the narrative, the media or whatever, saying that, now they have to be released from the sanctions of the EU. And that could take quite a while. They also have to, put out their, 2009 economic report. All these things have to happen before they actually, put their new currency out onto the market. Now, Zimbabwe has been digital, 100% digital banking on the new banking system since February 1st. It's the first thing that Putin did to try to start stabilizing the country financially and then being able to import and export. So, like people don't starve or whatever else. So the new currency was live in the digital banking system as of February 1st. So then what happened? So all this information was coming out last week. Now they're not going to be able to get, their financial forecast or whatever, their budget's done until like April 1st was the deadline. Then they didn't know if the EU, they were saying that the narrative was that the EU was going to put all these, different kinds of sanctions on them, new ones, not going to release them from the old sanctions. And then within the beginning of this week, all of a sudden, boom, they come out the gates running. So boom, their new currency hit, and it was global, which it's all asset backed. And I think it's called the RTGS currency. And so now they have a physical currency to go with their digital, the digital banking system. And then all in one day, they put out their budget, their 2009, economic report, and the EU lifted the sanctions off of them. So it all happened in one day. So there are some narratives that are being changed. I'm not so sure which might change the controllers or whatever that operate for the gods, that they were building the Tower of Babel to confront. I don't really know how that's going to change the gods that are controlling our rat maze. But, it may be kind of cool to see what happens, because then at least we own our own rat maze, right? We may be still trapped in it, but we have, maybe be able to experience something a little bit different in our rat maze as a part of whatever's happening or transpiring.
Maybe 2/3 of the people will go into space.
Yeah, all of it's just a narrative, and we'll just have to, we just have to see what's going to happen. So there, kind of like in closing here, there's a really great story that I like to tell. And it goes a lot along the line of traditional Zen Buddhism. Those people like to wait 500 years after things happen before they like to speak on it. The Zen Buddhism is like kind of like a long-term time frame, right? And so they like to see what happens, like an event that transpires, and they like to see how many hundreds of years down the road to see what the effects are, right? Kind of a situation. So Zen Buddhism is like a long-term study, sitting with, not doing anything for or against it, but just, waiting it out to just see how it becomes, right? So let's see, I have to think about this. This was a super long time ago, and it was when Miguel Ruiz, who wrote the Four Agreements, he also wrote the Fifth Agreement and the Master of Love, who is a lineage of Toltec shaman. he had just written the book, The Four Agreements. If anybody hasn't read that, I highly recommend that people read that. Because it will help you with the basic simplicity, get control of your mind, and off the narrative, you know. And I got invited, you know. I had heard about the Four Agreements through a friend of mine, and he was in town, and he had a student living in Reno, and so he came with the student. This was before he was on Oprah or got really famous. It was like, you know, way long before that. And he came and he was supporting his student. So he was kind of sitting behind in the front of his student. And he was allowing his student to kind of use the teachings that he'd given him to help, you know, us out there in the audience. And I'd say maybe there was like about 50 people. It was a very small audience. It was at one of the first, you know, yoga studios we had in Reno. So this is a long time ago. I don't know. It could be like 20 years ago, maybe even longer. And I was sitting up in front because I was like, you know, I'd read the Four Agreements, and, you know, I'm totally into the whole native thing, and especially dreaming medicine, Toltec, you know, you're just totally floored by all of that coming from, you know, my Russian lineage, shamanism type people. So anyway, so I'm listening, you know, to the student. The student's like not very good. And then at one point he kind of loses the audience, right? He loses us all. And a lot of us are getting irritated. You can feel like the irritation, and people are just kind of getting antsy and frustrated and moving around, and people aren't being real quiet. And you could just feel the energy shift. And I remember Miguel Ruiz stood at that moment, and he walked in front of his student, and he just stood in front of the audience, and he just breathed. And I have to tell you, like, out of all the people I've ever met, gurus, masters from all over the place, he had the most incredible energy that I have ever witnessed or ever been around. And the whole audience, like, calmed down. And then, you know, he was going to take our questions. And so, you know, we had questions. At the end of it, he stayed and waited at the door for all of us to walk out. And, you know, like, I'm always usually the last to leave. And I was walking out the door, and I remember talking to him. I said, you know, I just really have this, like, feeling like I should really, like, help the world, and I should really write books. And I said, but I just don't even know where to start. And I said, do you think books matter? I mean, I said, at this point in time, this is before the huge, you know, movement of consciousness really was, you know, starting to bloom. I said, do you think it really matters? You know, there's so many people out there now that are, you know, writing books and talking to people about a lot of this stuff. And what he said to me was like, well, we don't know. You know, long after we're gone, we'll see, you know, whatever we imprint this world with, or we imprint this reality with, or however we want to view it. We're going to have to wait for like 200 years. So we have to be really careful about not doing it for the ego, or to get something, or to manifest something, or some of these, you know, belief systems. We do it because, you know, we want to be part of the narrative, and what that narrative might be 200 years. And he said, we have to look at it 200 years down the road. So the last thing too is that recently, in the last year, a Native friend of mine, one of the work that we always do is we always talk about paying it forward for the next 7 generations, right? That's a very, you know, across the board Indigenous concept, is that everything that we do, every thought we think, is for the next 7 generations ahead. And I just found out this year, like in fall, that a generation is 500 years to the Indigenous people. Because back in the old days, people would have lived 500 years, right? There were, the original peoples were living, you know, 500 years. So each generation would be 500 years. So that's a whole other, like, if you want to take it as a spiritual concept, you know, a narrative, you know, what are you doing now that is paying it forward to the next 3,500 years? and not just a quick fix in the now. You know, if there is legacy, what would your legacy be? What would your legacy be doing? How would your legacy be left? And then, you know, playing that forward in the next 3,500 years. If there was no one to come and save you, there was no one to come and save this world, there was no one to come and free it from enslavement or any of those kinds of narratives, what would your life look like if you were going to add to the narrative, change the narrative, in your life now, here and now, and the period of time that you have while you're here in this narrative, and what would you imprint it into the world, you know, kind of a thing, which really starts to change things, from being saved to, or being harvested, raptured, ascended, being saved from the narrative, by the narratives, the people who created the narrative, which can't be really a good solution. But how would you change it? In what way would you change it? Kind of in, you know, like a bottom line, hold it in your hand, you know, like factual imprinting way. It's kind of a thought. So anyway, thanks for letting me talk.
You're welcome, my dear. This is The New Way on Steampunk Radio, on People's TuneIn app, or in studio. This has been Bridgette Lyn Dolgoff talking this morning. And boy, I've got 2 pages of notes. I'm going to be real happy when I review my show notes and figure out all the different places we've been. Thank you very much for your time, Bridgette.
Thank you, Lenny.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I lost it. Oh, there I am. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it was good. Next week, one of the days, I'm going to try and have Richard Allen Miller on. So if you want to come and be part of the studio audience for Richard's show, I'll let you know which day it is.
Okay. Well, if you need help handling them, just let me know.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah. We shall see. He is always a trip and very entertaining. But I was watching something else and his name came up and I thought, okay, people want to talk to Rick. We'll see about that. So I'll talk to Rick and hopefully have some things for him to talk about. He's quite an odd fellow, isn't he?
He is the true Mad Hatter.
And we are off. Station no longer on air.
Yeah, I have a hard time. I can't have Richard on my shows anymore. He just,